this speaker series event with the philosophy department at University of Colorado, Denver. And we are very pleased to have our colleague from history joining us for this event. Before I do the introduction for our speaker today, I wanted to let people know about the land acknowledgement statement that we have. In fact, I just learned about it today, and it's something that's posted with the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at our university. And it's a really fascinating context for the land that is now Auraria campus, our home at the university. And this was composed by Gracie Redshirt Tyan, who's director of the American Indian Student Services. And I'll read the part after the statement that land acknowledgement statements can help to remind us of the history, the contributions, and the sacrifices Native peoples have made. So the statement goes like this: we honor and acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. This area, specifically the confluence of the Platte and Cherry Creek rivers, was the epicenter for trade, information sharing, planning for the future, community, family, and ally building, as well as conducting healing ceremonies for over 45 indigenous nations. We must recognize indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land, and as these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, remember the ties these nations still have to their traditional homelands. Let us acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory, and pay our respect to the diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land. Let us also give thanks to all tribal nations and the ancestors of this place. And I thought it fitting to begin with this land acknowledgement. Philosophy as well as history are disciplines that are committed to acknowledging important truths that are so often neglected and oftentimes purposefully obliterated from our awareness. And in any case, I think it'll be important for the whole university community to take note of the land acknowledgement that we have. So today, I'm very happy to introduce our speaker, Professor Gabriel Finkelstein from the Department of History. Professor Finkelstein is a historian of science and modern European history. He received his PhD from Princeton, and he has numerous publications in the area of modern European history and history of science. I wanted to note one publication in particular, his book published in 2013, the title of which is Émile Dubois-Reymond, Neuroscience, Self, and Society in 19th Century Germany. It was picked for one of the best books of 2014. Today, his talk is titled Darwinian Trolls. And so we'll have the first half of our time together today for him to make his presentation, and then we'll have time for question and answer. I'd ask everyone to mute themselves for the presentation, and then we can open things up for question and answer later. So I'll turn the time over to Professor Finkelstein.
Thank you, Professor Metcalf. Thank you for hosting this CU Denver Philosophy Department lecture series. And thank you to your colleague, Sarah Tyson, who corralled me into giving this talk. Most of this is taken from my book, the one you just mentioned. I've been discombobulated. I've just moved and didn't have time to put together much original material, but I hope to reframe my work in the context of the lecture with some additional remarks at the end that I added, which I think will become apparent after I go through the talk. You'll see how there are many parallels between the time period that I'm discussing in the 19th century and our current one. So let me just start. On the 25th of January, 1883, the professor of physiology at the University of Berlin, Émile Dubois-Reymond, read an obituary of Darwin to the Prussian Academy of Sciences in celebration of the silver wedding anniversary of the Crown Prince and Princess. His thesis was simple. In the same way that Copernicus's theory had displaced the world from the center of the universe, Darwin's theory displaced man from the center of the world. As Dubois-Reymond emphasized, the naturalist innovation marked a new epoch in history. Afflavit Darwinius et dissipatia est would be a fitting inscription for a medal of honor of the origin of species. Now everything evolved from a few simple germs. Now we do not require successive creations, just a single act that set matter in motion. Now purpose in nature was replaced by a mechanical process, which is how we can regard natural selection. And now man finally took proper place at the head of his brethren. The main difference between the reforms of astronomy and biology, according to Dubois-Reymond, was in the reception. Copernicus's teachings had met with little favor, whereas Darwin's theory found wide acceptance. This triumph of science illustrated the progress of civilization, for, quote, while the Holy Inquisition persecuted the followers of Copernicus with fire and sword, Charles Darwin lies buried in Westminster Abbey. Darwin and Copernicus precipitated a torrent of criticism from the conservative press. This is in Germany. The first comment appeared in the Reichsbote, the most popular newspaper of German reaction. Before Darwin, man stood apart, the newspaper wrote. Since Darwin, everything evolved smoothly. Now we do not require any act of creation. Now everything follows from natural selection, and man takes his proper place at the head of his brethren, the apes. This clever shift of tense mood and number induced the Kreuzzeitung, the voice of Prussian aristocracy, to denounce the eulogy as lèse majesté. The Kreuzzeitung didn't care to see heretical professors tried before a court of inquisition, but it did expect the prosecution of those who opposed the moral order. Catholic responses were just as harsh. The Germania excoriated Dubois-Reymond's bestial doctrine, and the Königliche Volkszeitung would have recommended prison, but noted that, quote, professors like Mr. Dubois-Reymond, who refer to women in their lectures as human mother animals, the German is menschliche Muttertiere, should not be crowned with martyrdom. Paralipsis works. Invoking the term menschliches Muttertier defamed Dubois-Reymond's character, advising against police action, called for his arrest, and objecting to martyrdom urges ouster. Consequences could have been foreseen. Pastors reproached Dubois-Reymond for materialism. Catholic journalists deemed him worse than 100 nihilists. Anti-Semitic students threatened him with the law of the jungle. Critics sent him his photo with, "Look at this ape," scribbled on the back. Brother monkeys invited him to the zoo. Wags had him proclaiming fraternity with wildlife. One recommended that he join the lions, tigers, leopards, chickens, and jackals, the denizens of the East Indian forest. If India was too far, there was always the madhouse. Most condescendingly, an aristocrat implored him to drop the term menschliches Muttertier, since abusing women had never been, quote, the German way. This furor prompted Dubois-Reymond to apologize to Minister of Education Gustav von Goslar, whose presence at the speech had made him a target of attacks. Du Bois claimed that he would have reprimanded himself severely had his colleagues informed him that his language contained anything objectionable. However, he couldn't accept prohibitions on mentioning that animals possess feeling, that the earth revolved around the sun, and that God created matter with properties that resulted in the world. The mendacity of his critics filled him with disgust for the press, but he didn't expect their venom to trouble Goslar. Du Bois posted his letter none too soon. His colleague Rudolf Virchow must have alerted him to the likelihood that Christian politicians would raise the subject in the Prussian House of Deputies. And sure enough, on the 23rd of February, the leader of the anti-Semitic party, Adolf Stucker, lambasted his eulogy. Stucker was appalled that Du Bois had used a public ceremony to promulgate crass materialism. Professors were supposed to edify their students, not shock them with terms like human mother animal. Ludwig Windthorst, the leader of the Center Party, was similarly astonished that the rector had been permitted to lecture on Darwin without express reprobation. Men of the left answered these charges as best they could. Albert Henel, a progressive deputy for Kiel, accused Stucker of denunciation. The court chaplain had no business attacking Du Bois on the basis of a partisan newspaper article, Henel argued. By that standard, Frederick the Great would have been labeled a materialist. The real issue was the liberalization of Berlin's Faculty of Theology. Stucker was worried that Du Bois' views might bias Goslar's hiring decisions, but here the professor was protected. The Prussian constitution ensured the freedom of teaching and scholarship. In response, Goslar admonished Stucker to get his facts straight, reminding him that Du Bois had delivered his eulogy to honor a former member of the Academy. With this, the debate paused for the weekend, giving the minister time to prepare a rebuttal that might bring his parliamentary opponents to reason. On Monday, the 26th of February, the Center Deputy for Cologne, August Reichensperger, reopened proceedings with a barrage. Catholic clergy didn't enjoy freedom of instruction. Du Bois' beliefs were little better than those of the Redskins in the wild of America. Ernst Haeckel taught simian descent, and there was no academic counterweight to people a la Du Bois, Haeckel, and company. Stucker then turned on Du Bois, arguing that Darwin's theory was far from established, that conflating man with beasts was materialism, that a flavit Darwinius verged on blasphemy, and that, above all, natural selection eliminated purpose from the world. Gentlemen, he harangued his colleagues, I have no desire to see a godless mechanism prevail in our universities, and I'd much rather see professors, rectors, and secretaries of the academy at the apex of intellect than at the apex of animals. Stucker then grew passionate. Christians couldn't just stand by and let men with revolutionary tendencies be appointed to universities and showered with honors. The issue wasn't academic freedom, as Henel had suggested, since students didn't have to attend any lectures they didn't like. Rather, the issue was the proclamation of questionable doctrines at a festivity that required the presence of the government. In the past, free thinkers had kept their opinions to themselves. Now, with the salto mortale, these self-indulgent celebrities flout the teachings and experience of millennia. Germany was the country most susceptible to intellectual disorders. And because of this, theologians were not only justified, but obliged to direct their attention to Darwin. The right of the strongest, Stucker concluded, was threatening to turn German culture into a sea tossed by storms, today high, tomorrow low, until mankind ultimately founders on the cliffs of folly. Virchow replied by protesting that the debate was turning into a witch hunt. The truth was that nothing in Du Bois' speech had denied the existence of God. Stucker had confused materialism with mechanical explanation, or understanding things through their lawful occurrences. And what did the act of creation have to do with Christianity anyway? The real issue was tolerance. Medical professors would never challenge their religious colleagues. They understood that universities were meant to foster research, not to impart dogma. Besides, Du Bois was only fulfilling his obligations. As secretary of the Academy of Sciences, he was charged with paying tribute to those members who had died in the course of the year. the tone of his eulogy was overly warm, it still offered no cause for objection. Virchow portrayed Stucker as a bigot. Science no longer ridiculed the church as it had in the days of Voltaire. Each recognized the other's sphere. But respect had to work both ways. If everything came down to faith, why bother learning anything other than the catechism? The court chaplain had traduced the vocation of science, but science knew how to defend its honor. Even if everyone who speaks for it isn't capable of this, Virchow said, I expect that the German people will not appreciate Herr Stucker's language. Liberals in the chamber applauded. Windthorst replied by calling Darwinism an incomplete and unproven theory that didn't even deserve to be mentioned. Du Bois-Reymond's misconduct was obvious. He denied the Mosaic theory of creation, which undergirded the teachings of the church, and he had violated the Prussian constitution, which was based on Christian doctrine. The truth was that Christianity possessed an irrevocable, incorruptible, eternally valid content of revelation that couldn't be altered to suit the whims of science. Windthorst admonished the vain clique at the University of Berlin to drop their pretense of infallibility, hire Catholic scholars, and cease their war on religion. Goslar spoke last. A conservative veteran of the Kulturkampf, he ignored Windthorst's provocations, attesting that there was no academic coterie in Berlin, that he was sorry that he couldn't afford to appoint more junior faculty, and that even Stucker had recognized that Du Bois-Reymond had every right to say what he wanted. Pointed out that Du Bois-Reymond's detractors seemed to have forgotten that Heikel had once denounced him as a friend of the church, and that only last September, a prominent theologian had praised his modesty. Wasn't it interesting how quickly opinions reversed? Speaking personally, he found that the study of astronomy had deepened his own faith and remained convinced that religion had nothing to fear from science. Du Bois-Reymond expressed his relief that, quote, the time had not yet come for the introduction of the Inquisition in Prussia. He thanked Virchow for defending his honor, as well as that of Parliament, science, and the nation. His critics hadn't really upset him, but he admitted to feeling somewhat discouraged by the sight of the gulf that had opened up between academics and the, quote, mass of the so-called educated. Berliners like to poke fun at English religiosity, but in practice they possess little of the common sense that he had witnessed the previous year in Southampton, where the Bishop of Winchester had expressed his gratitude for a thoroughly Darwinian lecture that had been arranged for the working men of the city. Du Bois-Reymond also chastised the editor of the Nationalzeitung for failing to verify his comments. The vulgar expression, menschliches Muttertier, he explained, probably had originated in a misinterpretation of something he had said in a lecture. He had confused students and reporters before. The newspaper printed his letter with all the criticism expunged, leaving him to conclude that it wasn't really interested in anything he had to say. The encounter only widened his rift with the national liberals. In addition, Du Bois-Reymond wrote to inform Frau von Schmeling, the aristocrat who had accused him of disrespecting women, that his wife and children were grateful for the indescribable mirth that her letter had spread at their breakfast table. He swore that he had never uttered the phrase menschliches Muttertier and advised her not to believe everything that court chaplains might say. Unlike his critics, Du Bois-Reymond's advocates shared little besides an opposition to intolerance. Their breadth of support shows just how far German opinion had diffracted. Free-thinking socialists bashed counterfeit clerical scholarship. Darwinian journalists warned that subordinating science to the dictates of the church would spell the end of all culture. A contributor to a family weekly recalled that even the staunchest Catholics perceived no contradiction between Darwinism and Christianity. An enemy of evolution confessed to enjoying the hue and cry that the speech had raised among the Orthodox. Liberal statesmen argued against any restriction of academic freedom. And the provincial banker swore that thousands of laymen had joined him in the battle against superstition, hypocrisy, and ambition. In England, Nature reported that a whole sitting of the Prussian Landtag had been taken up by a debate on the graceful tribute to the memory of Darwin. Even Le Temps found the inquest peculiar. All this encouragement sustained Du Bois-Reymond's resolve during the weeks he felt buried under an avalanche of abuse. Especially helpful was the ovation that greeted them on the Monday after the publication of the Kreuzzeitungs editorial. Smiling at his students, he declared, "I take comfort in finding greater favor with you than with some of the local newspapers." The audience cheered for several minutes. Du Bois-Reymond reprinted Darwin and Copernicus in his collected addresses with a gloss that had offered a slice of German cultural history in the last quarter of the 19th century. His impulse had been to bury the affair, particularly after the satirists got a hold of it, with those on the right elevating him to heights of vertiginous monkey shine, and those on the left ridiculing Stucke as a malicious idiot. No one contested that his obituary was a performance. They only disagreed as to what kind. A public homage to Darwin or an implicit disparagement of religion. It wasn't as if thoughts of deriding the church had never entered Du Bois-Reymond's mind. For example, in 1884, while traveling between lectures in Cologne and Bonn, he'd seen two peasant girls kneeling before a wooden cross in an empty field. Nothing better in the Deutsches Theater, he had written to his wife. The Deutsches Theater was a theater that was famous for realist set decor. What strains any analogy to drama was the virulence of Du Bois-Reymond's attackers. Maarten van Nathusius, a theologian who imputed moral decline to the Jews, cautioned his readers against Du Bois-Reymond's brilliant, winning, and captivating arguments. Gail Godot, another anti-Semite, charged Du Bois-Reymond with abetting the closed phalanx of academic Jewry in the ruination of Germany. And Adolf Stucke exhorted his followers to stone the windows of Du Bois-Reymond's institute. Aggression is never ironic. By this point in his career, Du Bois-Reymond had learned to ignore provocation. The reason he didn't feel called upon to defend his support for Darwin, he explained, was that he had no interest in re-exposing himself to unworthy criticism. As far as he was concerned, his adversaries could stew in their impotent ire. Blind error, he wrote, quoting Giordano Bruno, deaf envy, vile rage, hostile zeal, cruel hearts, perverse spirits, bizarre passions will not suffice to obscure the air before me, nor place the veil before my eyes, nor ever stop me from beholding my beautiful son. In private, he adopted menschliches Muttertier as a term of endearment. A year after the uproar, he ended a letter to his wife, Jeanette, with this benediction. Above all, dear wife, mother animal of my young, in the bestial sense, today's date reminds me that it is your birthday. Accept from afar, the love of my overflowing heart, and you, O heavenly power, which created her for me, accept my contritest thanks for all your undeserved goodness and grace. The blessing must have worked. Stucker's career crashed, and Frau von Schmeling was never heard from again. Now I'll move into the last part of my essay, called Troll Theory. It's easy to see why Du Bois-Reymond's presentation enraged the Catholic press. The Roman Church in Germany was far from surrendering its claims to authority, especially after it survived the Kulturkampf of anti-clerical legislation in the 1870s. Du Bois-Reymond's intimation that its efforts were in vain must have struck its followers as particularly insensitive, given that recent elections had returned the greatest gains to left liberals keen on renewing the fight. Catholics had come to expect broadsides against their faith from popular writers. They didn't expect the broadsides to come from someone of the stature of Du Bois-Reymond. Now you need to remember Du Bois-Reymond was the professor of physiology or of biology at the University of Berlin, which was the most prominent university in Germany and most likely the world at that time. He was as famous as Darwin in England and as Pasteur or basically in France. was the leading biologist, considered the leading biologist at the time in Germany. But there's an even deeper reason for the reaction of the faithful. In 1883, Germany possessed a large socialist party that believed in the inevitable triumph of a classless society. Du Bois-Reymond's reading of Darwin supported their outlook, describing a world with no fixed order and no natural ranks, only the remorseless prospect of continual strife. To Catholics and conservatives, this was tantamount to anarchy. Truly, our society cannot endure on the basis of this materialism, wrote the Koblenzer Volkszeitung in response to Du Bois-Reymond's obituary. To what depths of barbarism and bestiality has science sunk? A man who profounds such radical theories is more dangerous than the worst socialist and revolutionary. In the same vein, the Frankfurter Volkszeitung wondered whether Darwin's theory wouldn't throw the order of the world into utter disarray, and whether professors who promulgated it weren't worse than, quote, 100 socialists, nihilists, and communists. Du Bois-Reymond's obituary, the newspaper argued, was little better than a warrant for the Red International to arm itself with bombs, petards, and gasoline. Darwin endangered civilization. Now, for most of his life, Du Bois-Reymond had reserved his expressions of contempt for religion for his wife and friends, permitting himself only a rare jest, such as when he advised a seminarian interested in his popular lectures that the study of physiology might dissuade him from his calling. His restraint eventually gave way. In 1870, he called theology a gray chrysalis. In 1872, he condemned doctrinal prejudice. In 1875, he scorned conventional beliefs. In 1877, he ridiculed fevered dreams of angels in heaven. And in 1880, he described medieval schoolmen as benighted by holy mania. In 1881, he juxtaposed the results of science with antiquated convictions. And in 1884, he characterized Diderot's encyclopedia as an engine of war that helped to breach the intellectual Bastille of courtly clerical France. His obituary of Darwin fell in line with this trend. Two developments accounted for his candor. The first was the politics of the left. Du Bois-Reymond always understood need. During his childhood, his father studied the problem of poverty. Before he married, he lived on a pittance. And after the age of 60, he lost his savings. All this deepened his sympathy for the indigent. He never considered socialism a threat. If anything, he viewed the Paris Commune as a reaction to political intolerance. Similarly, he discounted rumors of a conspiracy behind attempts on the Kaiser's life, and he deplored Bismarck's use of those crimes to repress the Socialist Party. In view of this record of concern for the poor and of the importance of Darwin as an inspiration to German workers, Du Bois-Reymond's presentation of evolution as a measure of progress has to be read as support for the socialist cause. Such endorsements may not have been necessary during the heyday of liberal ascendancy, when he could still get by with vague references to the dignity of man, but after 1878, opinions divided to the point where he had to take a stand. Darwin and Copernicus made his position plain. Darwin belonged to the future, and the church belonged to the past. This brings us to the politics of the right. In the same way that socialists accepted Darwin as a champion, Christians rejected him as an adversary. To be sure, there's nothing inevitable about this opposition. Darwin trod lightly on the subject of religion, and his interpreters generally understood that his theory didn't question the existence of God. Nevertheless, the church struggled to accommodate science in a society where the Kulturkampf had hardened clerical differences into intransigence. The same newspapers that berated Du Bois-Reymond for his address, for example, had previously attacked Hermann Müller, a Westphalian botanist, for mentioning evolution in class. Just like Du Bois-Reymond, the ministry was forced to answer in Parliament for scientists charged with inoculating pupils with materialism, and it eliminated biology from the high school curriculum in 1882. Critics of Du Bois-Reymond's obituary like to remind him that the imperial press law of the 7th of May, 1874, forbade any publication that denigrated the family, property, compulsory military service, or other foundations of civic order in a manner that undermined morality, patriotism, or the sense of law. What they didn't care to admit was that professors remain immune from censorship for anything spoken ex cathedra. This safeguard allowed German universities to serve as arenas of combat for contemporary debate. By the time of his 1883 oration, Du Bois-Reymond lost any qualms about entering the lists. Catholics and conservatives had been harassing him over vivisection for years. In the previous October, the Reichsbote had attacked his condemnation of anti-Semitism. Du Bois-Reymond drew a measure of revenge from likening his opponents to the vanquished of history. All this sniping testifies to the first element of a theory of trolls, namely symbolic politics. Darwin and Copernicus belonged to a tradition of anti-clerical literature that had run from Luther's tirades against the papacy to Voltaire's satires of religion to the philosophical pornography that circulated in the old regime. Intellectuals had always courted danger in attacking the church. They could end up tried, imprisoned, and even executed, as was the case with Minocchio, the 16th century Miller made famous by Carlo Ginzburg. Du Bois-Reymond preferred to phrase his arguments in the language of myth, appropriating the hagiography of martyrs persecuted with fire and sword to create heroes of Galileo or Darwin. Du Bois-Reymond's trolls employed the same technique, ridiculing his image as an ape, twisting his words into treason, and defaming his character with the absurd phrase, human mother animal. The thing about fake news, though, is that it depends on real news. There have always been Jeremiahs against authority, just as there have always been official sources of information. What's novel about the debate over Du Bois-Reymond's address is that it was driven by the attentions of a vast audience. No one seemed to mind his teaching of Darwin's theory within the confines of the lecture hall. It was only when he extended his authority to a public forum that Du Bois-Reymond incensed the conservative press. The debate in the Prussian House of Deputies merely magnified the show, allowing deputies across the political spectrum to score points with their constituents. None of this would have been necessary or even thinkable before improvements in literacy and transport carried news to readers far from the forums of Berlin. Access to media constitutes the second element of my theory. The last element, and in my opinion, the most important one, is social resentment. Tocqueville famously described how rising expectations prompted French revolutionaries to throw off the shackles of their oppression. Trolls are born from the opposite trend of falling expectations, one that engenders anger, fear, and jealousy in the face of a reconfiguration of the social order. The reaction to Du Bois-Reymond's obituary on this view was driven by a loss of privilege. In place of the elites traditionally associated with the royal occasion, Émile Du Bois-Reymond had celebrated a scientist, an atheist, and a foreigner. This was simply too much for German Catholics and conservatives to bear. They weren't so much outraged by Darwin as outraged that a prominent member of the immigrant Huguenot minority had used him as a reminder of their political decline. Well, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have time for question and answer. Professor Finkelstein, I wonder if you would like to call on people yourself. I'm not sure how to I'm not sure how to moderate with this medium.
I will be very grateful if you could call on people in my stead, because I'm going to be trying to focus on sounding intelligible.
Okay. All right, so the floor is open for questions, and I will do my best to moderate. Yeah, so Eric, did you have a hand up?
I don't believe so, no.
Okay, sorry, my fault. Professor Tyson.
Thanks. Thanks so much for this talk. It was really illuminating, and I appreciate this is a lot of history I had no idea of, and so really appreciate this insight into it. And it feels really connected to today. So I mean, this was part of the reason I wanted you to give this talk, is because you had said there are just these connections. And so I think one of the connections I'd love you to just talk a little bit more about, and I think historians hate this kind of question, so sorry, just ahead of time, but how do you, like, what lessons do you take for the situation of academic freedom today? Or what's maybe one central lesson that sort of has developed in your mind, looking at this earlier time, and especially given what's right around the corner for the sort of intellectual life of Germany after this, how you think about today based on this context?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The first part is easy to answer. The second part is harder. Well, the easy part to answer is that freedom from censorship is essential for academics. There's a whole book I read on German press censorship. It was so common for journalists to be accused and convicted of libel that it was standard practice for them to have a rota of who was going to sit out a few weeks in jail. So, the editorial staff would be, okay, it's your turn to go to jail now because we published whatever in the newspaper. So the newspapers weren't protected. But what's interesting is that the professors were, by this corporatist hangover from the Middle Ages, where they couldn't be shut up for anything that they said, as I mentioned, in the course of their duties. So what that meant was they could get away with anything. They could say whatever they wanted. Now, most of the professors tended to be pretty conservative, but occasionally there was someone like Dubois, who was quite liberal for a German professor, who would say something shocking and nobody could do anything. That's quite different from now. We are protected by First Amendment, but we don't have special protections for things that we say. As far as I understand, the last I heard about this was Ninth Court decision said that we are protected for what we say in the course of our educational duties, but it has to be related to educational. So that's an important distinction. They had, to be blunt, they had more freedom than we did, the professors, that is. The second point is, knowing German history and what's going to come, when I was reading through all this hate mail, which is what it was, basically, it's like a big pile of hate mail that Dubois had stashed and saved in his papers, I got really upset. I got kind of depressed and dispirited and horrified, and I didn't know what to make of it. And I thought, oh my God, I didn't understand the depths of anger and resentment and nastiness in German society, even in the 19th century. And I thought, boy, it's pretty clear how this turned into something much worse in the 20th century. There's a lot of anger 50 years earlier. Let me add, the last couple years have put things in a different perspective for me. Seeing that level of hatred and anger in other countries whose newspapers I follow, like Britain, France, and the United States, makes me realize, well, maybe there's nothing special about Germany in that regard. Maybe there's just large segments of the population that are really angry. And that's why I tried today to reframe this passage or this section of my book in a more general theory of trolls. Like, this isn't a uniquely German problem. This is just a modern problem. And so I had those 3 planks of my theory. That's what generates, when you have all 3, the resentment, the access to media, right? Then you're going to get something like what we saw with Darwin, which is, I think, why you'll agree, it looks awfully familiar, doesn't it? So it's like half historicization, right? It's not unique to the 1880s, but by the same token, it is modern, I would suggest. I hope that answered the question.
Thanks. Yeah, it was really helpful.
Thank you. Other questions? Well, if I may, let's see, I see Alex.
Yes, hello. Thank you for the lecture, Professor. It's very interesting. I wanted to ask, you mentioned that access to media like newspapers was one really important facet that enabled trolling at this level. Do you think that access to social media in the modern era has exacerbated this problem, or is there kind of a buffer since people are able to see more of a diversity of opinion and are usually able to access more like firsthand sources, so there wouldn't necessarily be the miscommunication that Emil was facing with his trolls?
Ah, that's a really good question, Alex. Alex is my student, everyone. She's making me look good by asking a good, tough question. Well, Darwin's speech was printed, and not immediately, but it was. So eventually people could have a record, and you're correct. There was fake news. They misquoted him. So that was a problem. But I don't know, Alex, that contemporary technology has curbed fake news any. So that part, I don't see a dissimilarity, but more of a similarity. And then what was the other part of your question? Can you remind me?
No, that was it. I was just wondering if you think it made it worse or if it's kind of better.
I think things haven't changed very much, sadly.
Okay, I see a question from Coleman.
Yeah, I guess my question is kind of along the lines of that, because it seems, I mean, I've had a lot of experience with trolls.
I'm sorry.
Well, so this is kind of my question, is that like, or I guess my trouble, I guess in a sense, is that there is a specific art to trolling. Trolling isn't necessarily always just like my, ridiculous reactionary views as loud as I can and as insulting as I can. But like trolling and fishing, you
Sure.
drag the thing behind, you're waiting for the bite, like in this sense, like Nietzsche would be a troll.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm kind of like,
Thank you for that, by the way.
yeah, I guess I'm just kind of wondering like about that like excess to the trolling, and I guess like in a way fake news is like it demands this force from the outside, I guess, and in the way it's kind of hard to tell in the example who's the troll, because the I can't remember the Darwin guy's name, but he was talking like against the sort of orthodoxy in a sense. He was he could have in a sense almost been a troll in a way. I'm not sure it necessarily, like, is the lie, I guess, necessary or something, or I just am trying to problematize it a little more. So sorry if that's a bit I'm not trying to be obnoxious or anything, but
No.
that's my thoughts.
That's good. Those are good points. What I didn't mention in the talk, and what I might have, although it's a little harder, were the satires. Some of which were really nasty, but some of which were actually kind of funny. So Du Bois was satirized in cartoons, and he was satirized in verse. So there was a whole, you're right, there was a whole spectrum of trolling, from just poking fun at this celebrity to being really vicious and hoping that he'd be imprisoned. And it came from everywhere. You know, it came from individuals, and it came from the politicians who I mentioned in the debate in the Prussian Landtag. It came in from the press, from every corner, all stripes of the press. And there were satirical magazines, there were comedy shows that would regularly make fun of people, celebrities, and they made fun of Du Bois. In fact, in the printed version of this, I have one of those satirical poems, but it's in German, so it's kind of hard to translate and have it still be funny. They're basically making fun of Du Bois for being pompous. That's usually how they trolled him. Nietzsche, glad you mentioned Nietzsche. Sorry, my camera froze. I'm glad you mentioned Nietzsche, because Nietzsche constantly attacked Du Bois, either sort of directly or indirectly in his writings. And he was constantly trolling him. And fortunately or unfortunately, Du Bois just ignored him. Nietzsche attacked Du Bois for writing too well.
Yeah, that's like a good troll, right?
Yes.
There's a troll that's like, it works and it's funny, and you can there's something positive to get out of that. There's a thought to be had.
I don't know. He said good German style wasn't elegant like Du Bois' French influenced style. He said Du Bois' writing was too elegant, and Germans should write in a more ugly manner, direct, plain manner. It's kind of hard to know what to make of that. Except, on a personal note, I had reviewer 2, who was German, complain that I wrote too well once. That was for a journal article. And another time, on a personal note, I gave a talk in German that I had written in English and translated into German. And the first comment after the lecture was someone in the audience who said in German, "I understood everything you said." Which wasn't meant as a compliment. Later, I asked a friend, I said, what does it mean? You know, like, I was told, well, you know, the German scholarly tradition, to appear profound, you have to be obscure. And I was told, you kind of sound like a 5-year-old. So maybe there's something to writing elegantly in German.
So I have a question for you, and it's hard to follow Nietzsche's trolling, but I wanted to ask you about what you mean by symbolic politics in your troll theory, but also I was interested in this question of the politicization of the university, because we experience that in a very particular way nowadays, but I'm wondering if, you know, the 19th century just is disanalogous to our own situation with respect to how the university has been politicized, or anyway.
Thank you, Rob. So, I think what's important here is that I was trying to come up with a way of understanding how this differed from just traditional criticisms of authority. Because I think it's pretty obvious, you know, the Bible has criticisms of authority. So if I said this is just a criticism of authority, I wouldn't really be saying anything new. I mean, then you would just say trolls are just critics and then leave it at that, and then you wouldn't have anything to say. So I tried to characterize how this kind of criticism differed from more traditional criticisms And that's what I meant by the symbolic politics. The criticisms were couched in figurative, mythic, or symbolic language, as opposed to direct, indicative language. So the debate here was over Darwin, who's a symbol of many things. No one really actually was debating the theory. They were just either saying we accept it or we don't accept it. We don't like what it suggests. They didn't really actually engage. This wasn't an actual scientific debate of what are the planks of the theory, what is the supports, what are the flaws of the theory. So Darwin just became a kind of political football that was batted around in the press and was batted around in Parliament. And that's what I meant by that. Am I getting at what you're trying to ask?
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Yeah, so the symbolic there has to do with the manner in which the criticism is made, and on the politicization of the university is, yeah, that seems like such a thorny issue because even we today are criticized for bringing politics into the classroom when it may be part of our educational duty to discuss whatever it is that in philosophy we're open to attack on basically any given day. And so I'm wondering if it was astonishing to me to hear you talk about the greater freedom that professors enjoyed at that time, but I'm wondering whether the university per se was politicized in a way analogous to how it is today or differently.
Oh, that's a good point. Let me just briefly follow up on reiterating a point in my remarks on the symbolic side. Du Bois did deliberately frame Darwin in opposition to Copernicus, and he painted Copernicus as a martyr and Darwin as a hero, and those are like symbols of saints. He's using Christian hagiography in a secular manner deliberately. So and I think he knew that would drive his opponents crazy because he's using their own language against them, the language of saints. All right, so then about the politicization of the university. This is really important. There's a classic study by Konrad Jausch that looks at students at the University of Berlin, and he identified that about half of them at this time were anti-Semitic, which is much higher than the general population in Germany at that time. There was a tiny minority that attended university. In the beginning of the 19th century, it was about 0.5%. By the end of the 19th century, it was 1%. Nonetheless, Germany was a country with the greatest number of university students per capita. So your point about politicization is well taken because these students were political. They were radical. And the professors weren't much better. I mentioned that Du Bois defended Jews because in the previous couple of years, there had been a kind of campaign against Jews that was provoked by a professor of German history. And even the liberal defender of the Jews did a really awkward, embarrassing defense, that was Theodor Mommsen, the German classicist, the guy who won a Nobel Prize for history. He said, well, Jews are pretty much assimilated, so we should accept them because they're not so bad. I mean, that was the defense. And Du Bois was one of the few professors to speak out on this issue, and he did so 3 times. He was an ethnic minority, being Huguenot. His father was a Swiss immigrant, and his mother had descended from a line of Huguenots. So he was sensitive to this issue, and several members of his family married Jews, and there were quite a few Jews that worked in his lab. There were a lot of Jewish biologists. So he came right out and said, this is horrific, this language of oppression. And not all of it was language. There were attacks and riots. So the point is that, to me, he understood that he was at the center of some very contentious issues and some really angry voices, and he wasn't afraid to speak up. And it's hard to know why. Maybe he was just a brave man, or maybe he knew that he was protected by law, or maybe he knew he had a way out. Because he spoke French, he had a standing offer to move to the University of Geneva by the rector there, who was a guy named Carl Vogt, who was much more radical than he was. Carl Vogt was one of these scientific materialists who was an early Darwinist, who basically used Darwin as a club to beat up the church and had to leave Germany and run away to Switzerland. So maybe because Du Bois knew he had an escape hatch, if necessary, he could afford to be brave. It's hard to know. But things didn't get any better. They only got worse. Du Bois also opposed going to war with Britain when there were cries for that. He'd originally, on the eve of the Franco-Prussian War, he had attacked France, but later regretted that he did it. And he apologized for that publicly, but the French they basically never forgave him for what he said. Unfortunately, many of his criticisms were true, which made them even more hurtful. So there were nationalist and racist issues that were kind of dividing the population and exciting a lot of anger and debate. And Du Bois seemed to have a kind of detachment. He understood very well that there wasn't much that can be done. I remember one answer, he answered one Jewish journalist who asked him if he thought that the resolution or the calming down of the sort of tirade against Jews meant that there would be a more positive outlook in the future in Germany. And Du Bois wrote back and said, he said, well, here in Berlin, we're advanced enough to hate Jews for their race, not for their religion. He made a sarcastic, cynical comment. And he said, when this issue goes away, we'll see the return of stupidity in other guises. So he wasn't, as a student of the Enlightenment, he had a long view of things, and he wasn't particularly optimistic.
Well, thank you for that. Other questions people have? Hatem.
Hi, first of all, thank you for sharing that. Second, I guess there's a few parts to this question, but I'm kind of seeing a connection between what you discussed and between the phenomenon that's being called cancel culture.
Exactly.
So I'm wondering if you see that connection,
Yes.
what the nature of that connection is, and if it's a threat to academic freedom.
Yes, yes, yes. Couldn't agree more. I didn't mention cancel culture, but yes, they tried to cancel Du Bois. Yep. Not a fan.
Okay, other questions?
Can I ask one, Rob?
Yes, please.
Yeah, Yeah, thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you could help us contextualize de Bourguignon in the intellectual history and perhaps in the history of philosophy as well, because in your other articles, I was really fascinated by this idea of recapitulation in race and romantic biology on the one hand, and on the other hand, how du Bois-Reymond was revitalizing like Lucretius and materialist tradition, right? So yeah, so I was wondering if I think that, and the idea of like repetition and recapitulation and like romantic biology, I think that'll help us understand the like fascism today and then a troll theory that you mentioned then. So yeah, I know it's a large question, but whichever you find interesting, you can help us see the bigger picture.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Now we're getting closer to philosophy of science. Du Bois-Reymond is best understood as a mechanist, reductionist, kind of a modern view of biology. But in the course of my research, I discovered that early in his career, he was a romantic. He got really excited by this guy named Henrik Steffens, who was a Naturphilosoph, had many romantic ideas. But that phase didn't last very long. It only lasted about a term or two. And then du Bois-Reymond read Lucretius when he was 20 years old in 1838. And I believe, this is my hypothesis, that it was this conversion to the Epicurean philosophy that enabled him to become receptive to Darwin's ideas. So I made this argument in my book because it's not well known among historians of science that du Bois-Reymond is the first German Darwinist. Most people think it's Ernst Haeckel, who was a big popularizer of Darwin. Darwin favored Haeckel. Darwin didn't like to surround himself with people who were as bright as he was, to be blunt. Most of the entourage or adherents of Darwinian theory were lesser scientists. People like Haeckel, in my opinion, is a lesser scientist. Du Bois-Reymond actually met Darwin because he had a friend in England named Henry Bence-Jones, who was one of Darwin's physicians, and it was Bence-Jones who had introduced du Bois-Reymond to the news that Darwin was writing a big book and it was going to be published. So this is important to remind the audience. Du Bois-Reymond didn't read the first edition, but he read the second edition. He got it around February or March of 1860, just after the publication of the first edition in November of 1859. And he read it over spring break. And then by April, he was a convert. And he openly taught Darwinian theory in what we would regard as in the modern form as early as 1861. In fact, he, in my opinion, was inspired to draw up a series of lectures, popular lectures on science by Darwin's theory, combined with the theory of his friend, Hermann Helmholtz, who had a theory of energy conservation. And most people would agree today that energy conservation and natural selection are the two big theories of the 19th century as far as unification. So now getting to your point about recapitulation. So du Bois-Reymond was not a recapitulationist. He sort of started out a little bit with a kind of recapitulation, but then he was one of the first to abandon it. And he was also one of the first to abandon the inheritance of acquired characters. In my opinion, he read the work of his fellow colleague, an anatomist by the name of Hiss, H-I-S, who is an opponent of Haeckel. And du Bois-Reymond, in a popular speech, rejected the inheritance of acquired characters, what we would call Lamarckianism. And that inspired August Weismann, perhaps the second greatest Darwinian theorist after Darwin, to also reject the inheritance of acquired characters 6 months later. So very few people know that du Bois-Reymond was the inspiration for that too. So here you have a man who's a physiologist. He's a neurophysiologist, and this is quite interesting. He's a neurophysiologist, and yet he's the first adherent to Darwin among German professors, and the first to teach it in a university setting. So how do you explain this? Well, I said the Lucretian outlook, in my phrasing, is what enabled him to extend his mechanism from the microscopic to the macroscopic, from the level of cells and tissues to the level of organisms, right? So from the lab to the field, to be blunt. And that enabled him to create a vision of the world that was mechanistic, in opposition to the one that had been presented by his mentor, Alexander von Humboldt, who wrote a popular, all-encompassing vision of science called Cosmos that was romantic in outlook. So Du Bois said the modern outlook is not romantic at all. And he even went so far as to say, if Goethe were around today, he would be utterly horrified at our vision of the natural world, this Darwinian world that looks really awful. It's really bleak, and there's nothing aesthetic in it. It's just competitive and nasty, and works mechanically. And that explains the apparent teleology that he finds, that one could find in nature, the apparent order to the universe. Now back to the last part of your theory, the recapitulation part. So, hope I'm not going too fast for people, and please interrupt me if this is obscure. And I have a sociological explanation of romanticism. It's kind of like a conservation theory. It looks a little Freudian. So it's a kind of conservation of ambition theory. Basically, it helps explain. It also, I have the theory to explain gender polarity. Maybe I'll do the gender polarity first. Basically, in times when people have more access to advance in their careers, they spend more time on their careers. When they're blocked in their careers, or they're blocked politically, then that ambition that might have been expressed, either earning money or getting honors in your career on the one hand, or exerting power, or creating institutions on the other, has to be directed somewhere else. And people either direct it into private life. That helps explain diminution of gender polarity during periods of economic decline or political repression. And in periods of economic expansion or political opportunity, there's greater interest in career and less interest in the family and the home. By the same token, in periods of political repression or economic stagnation, romantic ideas are more popular because the intellectuals look for agency and beauty in places that they can't find politically and in the public sphere. So they just invest them either in the self or in the natural world. So if they invest them in the self, you get a kind of German idealism that looks more like Fichte, and you invest them in the world, you get German idealism that looks more like Schelling. It's really like two sides of the same coin, in my opinion. And that's driven by social conditions, not only by intellectual predilections. So Du Bois is not romantic at this time precisely because his career is going gangbusters. You could argue that once he solved the problems of his career, he could jettison romanticism. And he even addressed this issue directly in public. He said that in another address, he said, Germans have been too attached to Goethe. He attacked Goethe. And this, boy, they didn't like that either. Basically said Goethe was all about the deed. And Du Bois said that may have made sense when we were weak, but now we're big and strong, and we need to abandon this romantic outlook, abandon the desire for transcendence, accept limitation, and even accept renunciation. That's basically the moral of my book, is I'm suggesting that the United States now is still suffering the same romantic error. We still are attempting to achieve transcendence, and maybe we should accept limitation. because we too are big and powerful, and we don't need to transcend so much anymore. We can accept our diminished place in the world. This is the lesson Du Bois tried to convey, but I don't think many people paid attention. Did that answer everything? Okay.
Okay, other questions? I did have another question if we don't have other takers, which is, I mean, it makes sense to me that Du Bois-Reymond would engage in polemic against, the Catholic Church in Germany at that time. But did he critique religion more generally? I mean, was he an irreligious theorist, would you say?
I think he was atheist, but he didn't come out in public and say it. In public, he looked more agnostic. So he looked more like Huxley. He referred to a creation and a creator, but he's pretty atheist. The people he likes are 18th century French atheists. He likes La Métrie, he likes Voltaire. So it's just that he didn't want to be lumped in with the overt atheists, and some people did, and he was angry at that. He didn't want to be lumped in with Büchner and Vogt. He thought it would hurt his career, and he thought that their views were a little too crass. But what's interesting is that he and his best friend, Ernst Brücke was also a physiologist who had the chair in Vienna. He was Freud's teacher. From their letters, they complain more about the church than they do about socialists. They see the church as the greater danger, and they're not afraid of the socialist movement. And that's quite interesting because, most Du Bois usually take him to be conservative, which he isn't. He certainly is a liberal, but in this presentation today, I'm making the argument that he revealed himself as a socialist, which was unheard of among university professors. Just basically by supporting Darwin, he said, I support the socialist cause, which you have to understand that was a party that had been banned. Bismarck used the pretext of an assassination. You could think of a terrorist attack to ban his political enemies until 1890. So during the ban, for a German university professor to come out and say, I side with the socialists, it was pretty provocative.
Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. Other questions?
Let me add one more point about Epicureanism. I wish I had knew more philosophy when I started my research, because it took me forever to figure this stuff out. For a while I thought Du Bois was a Stoic, and then it's like, no, he's an Epicurean. And they didn't understand that, Lucretius was a kind of badge of honor among the, French atheists. Du Bois' hero, Frederick the Great, apparently kept a copy of On the Nature of Things in his breast pocket when he went into battle. It was like his personal Bible. It was going to protect his heart if he was shot. So for those interested in history of philosophy, there is a dissertation or a book on what happens to Lucretianism in the 19th century, because it's not very well known. There's been good work done on the 18th century, and there's good work done on the early 19th century as far as literature and the arts. But there's not a lot of work on basically what happens between Goethe and on the one hand, and then what happens to the mid to late Victorians on the other. There's a kind of blank there. Well, what happens to Lucretius? Who's reading him? There's translations I found in the 1820s and 1830s, but It was really repopularized in the English tradition by Du Boismon's colleague, John Tyndall, at the famous Belfast Address in 1868, I believe. So if anyone knows, tell me, because I'm curious.
Marx wrote on Lucretius, right?
Sorry?
Karl Marx.
Oh, Marx, yeah, Marx did. And Marx also wrote romantic poetry when he was young. So Marx is Du Boismon's exact contemporary. They're both born in 1818. So they kind of went through the same phases of romanticism and then on to Lucretius. We have Hatem and Ed, I see, have their hands up. Hatem.
So I guess this is so this is kind of a follow-up. In what ways is cancel culture then a threat, and how can we fight it to protect academic freedom?
Well, Hatem. Now we're getting, this is kind of hot, isn't it? So, I mean, I think it's kind of interesting that the right is claiming to defend civil liberties now, which is, I don't have any problem with defending civil liberties. I just would have liked to have seen a little more consistency in the past. You know, they have leveled criticisms against the left at being intolerant of opinions they don't like. So I have my own opinion on this, but I come from a line of civil libertarians. For the record, my uncle defended the leader of the American Nazi Party in 1953 for the ACLU, and my uncle's a Jew. So you could say he did that for the notoriety, but he also had some convictions that he was willing to take a very unpopular stand at that time during the McCarthy era to defend civil liberties. So I come from that tradition. I come from Hannah Arendt and Isaiah Berlin, libertarian tradition of freedoms of speech. It's currently sort of out of vogue, I suppose. That's just my personal opinion. We can protect it. I mean, it's usually protected legally, right? So there's First Amendment protections. But it might also be important for people in positions of power and authority not to immediately jump on the bandwagon and cancel people, because that has a chilling effect on freedom of speech. This is a big can of worms. There were some pretty repugnant people that I've personally defended. In the past, there was a famous Holocaust denier that used to come to campus. I don't know if you guys remember this guy. There was a faculty member in the German department that used to invite the world's most notorious Holocaust denier to his class on an annual basis. And I knew about this. I think he had a right to speak. I contacted personally those who had been attacked by this Holocaust denier and asked for their advice. And a former dean asked me for my advice, and I said, I don't think you should cancel the guy, but you might make a statement. But that didn't happen. And basically the attitude was, and it's not ridiculous. If we ignore this, people might not notice. And if you respond to the provocation like the troll, right, then that might be exactly what they want. They might want the notoriety. They might want the news there, and this will embarrass the university and upset people. And so I actually advised my colleagues in a faculty meeting when they found out about this and they were outraged. I said, don't do anything. Don't protest. Ignore this. So I don't know if my decision was correct, but I think the fact that this isn't common knowledge, that the world's greatest Holocaust denier came to our campus, is maybe a good thing. All right. So I'm for And let me say also on a personal note, I had the misfortune of having a Holocaust denier attend one of my classes, a student. So, I didn't believe I had the right legally or ethically to shut the student up, but it was difficult to deal with a Holocaust denier. So I actually went on the line and talked to genocide and Holocaust historians and asked them for their advice. And they said some interesting things, Hatem. They said, you can do three things. You can either ignore the person, you can ridicule the person, or you can debate the person. So I thought, it's kind of hard to ignore. Ridiculing is not a good strategy if you're a professor. You don't want to abuse your power. So I just debated the student. The student passed the class, did well, but was pretty awkward. So I think we have to try to confront reprehensible opinions with conviction. I wouldn't say tolerance, but I think it's a sign of insecurity and I would argue a lack of intellectual confidence if you don't think you can debate people with reprehensible opinions and defeat them. And by defeat them, I mean not just winning that argument, but by swaying anyone listening to their arguments. So I'm all for engagement. Maybe that's a positive way of putting it. Show everyone how ridiculous, absurd, stupid, idiotic, and abhorrent their views are. But maybe someone else has a different opinion of how to fight trolls, because this is about trolling, right? I say beat the trolls. Ed.
Slightly different question, or
okay.
Matter. Was Ernst Heikel a socialist too? And the reason what was his leanings? The reason I ask is, Marx was such a huge fan of Darwin and adopted some of Darwin's ideas in his own methodology. The subject of your book has socialist leanings, and I'm just wondering if there's something about Darwinism,
yes,
the dialectic, if you will, that particularly with scientists like kind of with socialist tendencies, if you will.
Right. Haeckel was more conservative than Du Bois-Reymond, but you're correct. The socialists viewed Darwin as their champion because Darwin presented a view of the world, in their opinion, that was progressive and operating according to natural law. And they basically saw the aristocrats as atavisms. They thought they were dinosaurs. They thought they were going extinct, quite literally. And they thought that time and history was on their side, and it was inevitable that they would prevail. So you're absolutely right. Socialist champion Darwin was kind of not all that happy about it.
Well, actually, he took his ideas from Malthus and Adam Smith. So yeah. With a weird line running through there,
yeah,
kind of ironic.
But that's interesting that they would have him as their champion, and particularly if you look at some of the more controversial or even reprehensible attitudes that Darwin had when it came to human populations. I think you could say at best he had quite sexist and imperialist, and I have to be careful if I call him racist, but his attitudes towards people who weren't British gentlemen wasn't exactly charitable. In that respect, as you know, Alfred Russel Wallace was much more open-minded when it came to different classes and different peoples, because Wallace was from a working class background. So when he went to the Amazon, when he went to South America and met natives, he admired them, whereas Darwin was pretty much just horrified by everyone he met who was native.
Thanks.
Sure.
Okay, other questions? Chris.
Hi. Can you hear me? My mic's
Yeah.
awesome. So I had a quick question about, I guess, is trolling more associated with conservative groups, I guess? I'm looking at what your student wrote in the chat, Alex. They talked about trolling being a reaction to a perceived loss of social power. I'm thinking contemporarily, thinking about Bannon, taking advantage of white males, trolls in American culture. Is there something about that loss of social power that makes trolling something more often associated with conservative reactionary groups?
Well, if you have a leftist and progressive view of history, then you would say yes, because you would say that the conservatives and the religious are losing authority over time. The problem is how quickly. It's that the stuff I'm talking about is in the 1880s. It doesn't look very much different now, is the point Sarah made, right? So, how much are they losing authority? I can get myself into hot water if I say they were losing authority, as Du Bois thought they were, when in fact they don't. The right maintains its authority in many respects, and it continues to today. You could say that they're worried about a widening of the electorate, and that they feel that they will inevitably lose if demography continues to change, which is why they're interested in reforming the electoral laws as they understand it, because they won't win by sheer numbers. But there is something about the persistence of the right, the right. That's a difficult question for historians to explain. How do they persist for so long? This is a major intellectual problem for political theorists. I'm sure Saren understands this more than I do. Major problem for political theorists in the 20th century. How is it that the right became popular? The whole Frankfurt School basically arose to answer that question. Like, why did fascism become popular? So my argument that they're losing relative position and authority, you could come back at me and say, well, Gabriel, how quickly? So I'm basically attacking my own argument there. It's a neat argument if it works, but if you try to fit it to the historical reality, you could poke some holes in it. Right. Say you're right. But maybe I can say in Edward's sense, Edwin's a geologist, so all I have to do is say, well, the timescale's just too short. They'll eventually go extinct. But I don't know.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I was it's tough not to talk about those things in like a contemporary sense with everything going on.
Well, thank you everyone for the questions, and it's been a really lively and interesting discussion. Please join me in thanking our speaker for the event today. All right. Thank you, everyone, and we really appreciate it. This has been a great event for the philosophy department.
Thank you. It was fun to meet you all. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming over to our neck of the woods, and I'm hoping that when it's possible, we can celebrate this occasion with like a department dinner. It'd be nice to,
it's never gonna.
What's that?
I'll have to get shots.
Yeah. So it's like a long rain check, Gabriel.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you thank you, everyone. And Baram, what are you studying? Are you a philosophy major or grad student?
I'm a faculty in the philosophy.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
I'm sorry. Please.
I do French philosophy, 20th century.
Oh, okay. Yeah, most people don't know about those strange